Hello. This is the summary of my 7th week of dev streams. There's nothing particularly worth mentioning at the beginning, so let's just get to the summary. As a usual reminder, link to my Twitch channel is in the description. I stream on every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 15 of Central European time, as well as on Saturdays later at 19 or more often 20. Any exceptions to that are informed on my Discord server, which is also in description. Monday was a tiring day, partially because I don't know why, but apparently if a day is special in any way, you have to have additional problems that day. In my case, I had Names Day on Monday, and just so turned out that this day I was extremely pissed off by everything, including what I was doing on the stream. So on Monday, I was working on the pathfinding, and specifically, I was working on a grid. I decided I'll just go with a 3D grid and just have anything done, and then I might experiment with other things. For now, it would be a kind of expensive thing. Even for such small resolution rooms as I have, which are typically 13 by 13 by 7 cells, already gives you over 1,000 grid cells per room. That might fit well for a runtime system, but maybe not necessarily for a course data. So that's a thing to we can find out how to make it work actually. Nonetheless, what I got was kind of ready for use. There was just one problem. Because you see, when you have a grid, you want to also know which grid cells are obstructed, which ones are grounded, and so on. And there was a problem. For the test meshes I decided to use for levels, I made them in ProBuilder. And ProBuilder isn't particularly different from making a model in Blender for the levels. But the issue is, both of these approaches use mesh colliders. And mesh colliders are kind of fucking difficult to figure out how to make them cheap to query what do they obstruct. And at the additional difficulty that I didn't knew anything, and I decided to use help from ChatGPT instead of looking on the internet how it's done, like a civilized person. And the chat apparently that day got into silly mode and posted some really dumb stuff. So what I ended up doing that day in terms of finished results was the not quite working grid, as well as I've added some small sounds to test some things, just to have, things like empty gun click sound or a bullet landing somewhere. Apparently something went wrong. And also Unity screwed up something with compilation, and for some reason, when doing things with strictly Fmod and the audio system, for some reason the builder levels went to absolute trash and they refused to render, and in general something's messed up. So yeah, Monday was a tough day. Alright, here's me after the Friday stream, and after 2 takes at recording this. Today something's really wrong with me, but whatever. So I'll actually stitch Wednesday and Friday together, because on both days I was doing basically the same thing. And before I touch on that, I'll just quickly revoke what I just said about issues with ProBuilder. It wasn't an issue with ProBuilder, it was an issue with me, specifically with the fact that I forgot to add the new level layer to the culling mask of the main camera. And so this layer simply wasn't displayed in any way, and that's why the meshes didn't display. So in terms of the thing I was struggling with on Wednesday and Friday, I was battling with properly flagging all the grid cells in a grid as obstructed. And long story short, I was simply struggling with how to check with physics methods whether the cell's bounds are inside the collider or not. There was a lot of ideas, and none of them worked quite well. And so I ended up using a quite expensive approach, but at least it somewhat works, and I can be sure that it's deterministic up to some low level Unity shenanigans. And so I decided that the level mesh will be baked into the grid because it's a static thing and it won't change like ever. And every other object probably won't be a non-convex object that will require some strange mesh calculation. And so, since we're talking about baking the grid, for now it's just simply calculated at a wake. I might later change that to a serialized form where you have compilation of this data into assets, but that's a project for another day, honestly. So baking everything on awake could also excuse working on something like a loading screen, since basically every game has some form of loading screen. I might do just exactly that for doing stuff like this, where you toggle on every zone, you calculate all the grid meshes, and then you clean up everything and you just display the things that are just in the player's range. So, what did I do to calculate every obstruction of every cube? My end method was to take the physics checkbox method, which returns a boolean if the box you've provided overlaps with any collider, that is, any collider that is masked, obviously, in the way you want. And you don't perform this checkbox once at your bounds. What you do is that you would take actually 8 copies of that box and you displace them in the direction of every vertex of the original bounds. These 8 boxes you can treat as a new kind of cube, except that each vertex has some data assigned, whether it intersects or not, and using that you can check if something is truly inside or outside something. If something is inside, then simply every box will touch something. And if at least one doesn't, then it means that this cell is outside. Now, the amount by which those boxes are moved away from the center is by definition minuscule. Though, to just be sure about robustness, I implemented the distance to be actually variable and to be assigned in the inspector so that one zone might have infinitesimal displacement, while another zone might require a slightly bigger one. And so that's really it. Just a short technical solution for you. And that would be it. Sorry if, again, that was a really short summary with no real substance, but in general, I wasn't doing much on these streams, mainly because I began those streams with extreme scatterbrain, and I decided that I'll just do my 40% on those streams and do whatever things to just push the project a bit further. And I left that to focus on some private stuff because I have a bit of things going on, and so it might last like this for a bit longer. And I think it most certainly will, for at least the next week. Maybe later it will be more substantial, but now it will basically look like this. So, yeah, that's everything I have to say. Have a nice day and see ya next time.